thank you all for coming today. This is actually the second program that we have done as a joint Friends of the Dole Institute and Student Advisory Board program. So we'd love to get your feedback onto what you think of this kind of program format. And as we are continuing to build connections between these two groups, we encourage each of you to consider being a part of the Dole Institute's mentoring program this year. I know a lot of you in this room have taken part in that in the past. So if you're a friend and would like to know more about that, you can come to our Friend Ambassador meeting on September 9th. And I believe there's also a Student Advisory Board meeting that night as well that students can find out about that. But today, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Sasha Issenberg. This is actually the second time that Sasha has been to the Dole Institute. He was here for an evening program in the fall of 2012 to discuss his book, The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns, which is the definitive book on the analytic nature of today's political campaigns. How many of you here today were here for that program? Great. Sasha is currently a fellow at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs Center for Civil Society and is a prominent journalist, having written for the Boston Globe, the New York Times Magazine, the Atlantic, Slate, and among many others. He is currently doing research for his upcoming book, The Engagement, A Quarter Century of Defending, Defining, and Expanding Marriage in America. As a Dole Archives travel grant recipient, he is researching the Defense of Marriage Act in its legislative context. Support for the Dole Archives research grants is provided by the Friends of the Dole Institute, so through many of you. So we thank each of you for helping to bring back Sasha here today. So with that, please help me in welcoming Sasha Issenberg and our senior archivist, Audrey Coleman.
So Sasha, welcome back to the Dole Institute. You were last here in 2012. We're so happy to see you again. What have you been up to since your last visit?
So I just trying to remember exactly the date. Well, thank you all, first of all, for coming, for helping to bring me out here. And I should note that working on a book for a couple of years is often a fairly solitary experience, and especially the weeks I spend in archives are usually just me and a stack of paper. And so it's quite nice to have sociability imposed upon me here. So I came, the last book came out about 2 months before the 2012 election. And so that fall I was both traveling around talking about it and doing some reporting for Slate, sort of looking at the same themes that I was writing about in that book, the sort of scientific revolution that had taken place in campaigns in the context of that Obama-Romney election. I already had sold the proposal for this next book to my publisher, the same publisher, Crown, who had put out the last book. And I have spent the bulk of almost the last 2 years working on this book, this history of the battles over gay marriage in the United States. I've been moving around a bit as I did it. I spent last fall in Boston at this institute's sort of sister organization at Harvard, the Institute of Politics there, as a fellow. And I've been based at UCLA as a writer-in-residence fellow. They keep on changing my title on me. But in both cases, given the nature of what I've been writing about, there was a lot. We can talk a little bit about this history, but New England was the first region in the country to actually have gay marriages, and so being based in Boston was incredibly useful for my research and reporting in Massachusetts, but also particularly in Vermont, and obviously the West Coast and California in particular have been the site of some really important political and legal machinations around marriage. And so in each case, there were very nice institutions that have had me, but geographically good basis for the type of stuff I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you mentioned that you sold the project at the same time as your previous book, and so you mentioned was it just your geographical context that got you interested in this project, or were there anything else, any other inspiration?
So I basically wrote the Victory Lab, reported it, wrote it in 2011, and a lot of the time I was interviewing pollsters or other people who were studying public opinion in politics in some form or another. And repeatedly in my conversations with these people, usually in the context of making some other point, people would say, and I heard this repeatedly, that they've never seen opinion on a single issue move as quickly as they had on the issue of marriage. And I would often ask these, experts in public opinion, well, why do you think that is? And nobody ever could sort of explain it to me. And when I thought back on the arc of this, I'm 34 years old. I've lived through the entirety of this debate on gay marriage. I've covered politics in some form or another for a large part of this arc. I have seen it, as pretty much everybody here has, and yet I don't entirely understand how opinion in this country moves so quickly on this issue, and now laws are following. And it's specifically the type of issue that I think both experts and lay people assume that public opinion would move very slowly. People's ideas about marriage are grounded in ideas about tradition and religion, and we don't think of it as, I think the assumption was that this wasn't the type of, a technical question where, do you think we should have, ground troops in Iraq, and then you see, something horrible on the news and you change your opinion the next day because the facts have changed, right? You'd sort of assume that any mature person, by which I mean just anybody who's like sort of reached adulthood and has like fully formed worldviews, would have an idea as to what they think a family looks like or could look like or should look like. And that the shift that we've seen, basically the shorthand is, that public opinion in this country has gone from 25-30% of people supporting gay marriage to 55-60% of people supporting gay marriage in under 20 years. That's a really remarkable thing, and I think very few of us have I never felt like I was seeing that change in front of my eyes. I think now that we're starting to see laws change, it's becoming a lot more evident, and nobody has written a historical account of how that happened. So my goal is to write a sort of unified political, legal, social history of from the emergence of gay marriage as an issue, or as a policy option, to it being an issue of, I think, great weight or significance in our politics, to what is starting to look like, the Supreme Court will probably have something to say soon about what the end looks like, but I think everybody on all sides of the issue thinks we're starting to see where this ends, and the only question is how and when exactly, and whether it happens, through federal courts or incrementally through state courts or through a combination of courts in the political process. And so, so I've been trying to reconstruct that history.
Okay, so backing up a little bit, because you mentioned we're talking about history. It's recent history. We don't acknowledge that we're talking about the 90s as history. But can you give us a little bit of background of the Defense of Marriage Act and maybe why it came about when it did, and you talked about some of its impact today. So what was kind of the currents going on?
So the Defense of Marriage Act was a bill that was introduced basically more or less simultaneously in the House and Senate in early May of 1996. And it had two functional provisions. It said that the meaning of the terms marriage, husband, and spouse, wherever they appeared in federal code, which was, I think, the word marriage appeared over 800 times, and husband, wife, spouse in various combinations appeared over 3,100 times in the federal code, that they would be interpreted only to refer to pairings of people of opposite sexes. And the other provision of the bill was stipulated that individual states were within their right under the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution not to recognize same-sex marriages that originated from another state. They could if they wanted to, but they were under no obligation to, as states are understood to be under the obligation of recognizing a heterosexual marriage license. You get married in Kansas, you drive across the border to Oklahoma, you're just as married as you were here, and all the rights and privileges and responsibilities and sort of secondary legal arrangements that flow from that are treated by the judge in Oklahoma the same way that somebody would here. When this emerged, it came almost out of nowhere. This was not the type of sort of political issue that had been debated. This isn't Obamacare where people have been talking for decades about what's the next step going to be on healthcare reform, and then finally a piece of legislation comes and addresses it. This was, to people on both sides of the issue, a fairly novel question. The question of what does the federal government do about gay people trying to get married was entirely novel, because the question of gay people trying to get married was entirely novel. And so the sort of proximate trigger to this was a court case in Hawaii that started in 1990. It was filed in 1991. It was 3 couples in Honolulu went in to request marriage licenses from the Hawaii Department of Public Health. It was 2 lesbian couples and one gay male couple. They were eventually turned down. They sued the state. They lost in trial court. They appealed to the Hawaii Supreme Court, and to everybody's surprise, the Hawaii Supreme Court ruled in their favor and kicked it back to trial court with a very high burden of proof. That Supreme Court ruling came down in May of 1993. It was going to go back to circuit court in Hawaii, and everybody that looked in this case said the state is going to have a very difficult time proving in this case that there is a compelling state interest in maintaining what it described as discrimination in the way that it assigned marriage licenses. For a few reasons, this took a while to get noticed or fully appreciated on the mainland, probably the biggest of them being that Hawaii is very far away and fairly easy to forget about and doesn't get a lot of regular national media coverage. And so there were stories that were mostly of the gee whiz variety at the beginning, like, hey, guess what? The Hawaii Supreme Court says that 2 men can marry. And then it sort of fell away from public attention for a while. And this was the first time that any court in the United States, and depending on how you interpret anywhere on earth, had basically ruled in any way sympathetic to the idea of gay couples having a legal status equal to straight couples. And so it took a while, I think, for people on both sides of the issue, and probably it's better to talk about this as at least a 3-sided issue then, where there were folks mostly in the gay rights movement who were in favor of this. There were folks, most organized through sort of religious, traditional, conservative movement who were opposed to it. And then there were a lot of people who were just sort of surprised and had never had to formulate an opinion on gay marriage, because it was like, if I asked you, should we go to war in Bolivia tomorrow? I doubt any of you would say, like, well, I've always been against the war in Bolivia. You'd probably have to give it some thought. And I think that for most people it was sort of a question on that level. And so as it got closer to trial in Hawaii, and the trial ended up, it was delayed a whole lot because of the legislature got involved. But eventually went to trial in September of 1996. And as it moved closer to the trial, people in the mainland started thinking about, hey, what are the legal consequences for the rest of the country if the state loses and a judge orders the Department of Public Health to, next time gay couples show up and request marriage licenses, says that you have to give it to them? What's that going to mean? And the interpretation was, from among folks who were concerned about this, was that these 2 things would happen. One is couples, same-sex couples from around the country would go to Hawaii and get married. The idea that Hawaii is a desirable place to get married to begin with, I think, made visions of this fairly easy. If there are any North Dakotans here, I apologize. If North Dakota had been the first state, folks might not have been so concerned about, North Dakota honeymoons falling into vogue. So I think there was one idea, which is, if couples from Kansas go to Hawaii and come back to Kansas and with their marriage licenses, will Kansas be forced to recognize them, number one? And then the other thing is there are all these places in federal laws where the federal government treats married couples differently in the tax code and all sorts of federal benefits, obviously, that we get, veterans hospitals, you name it. And the question was, won't the federal government have to recognize a couple with a Hawaii marriage licenses under federal laws? And so this bill was drafted pretty quickly, and there was, and it basically shows up to the surprise of definitely folks in the gay rights movement, folks in the White House, and the media who had not been paying close attention to this issue, and for good reason. It kind of just shows up, and it gets basically moves through the House and Senate fairly quickly that summer, and ends up passing the House after some contentious debates in the summer in July, and then moves on to the Senate. Passes the Senate in the first week of September. And 12 days later, Bill Clinton, without a lot of fanfare, sort of famously a Friday night at midnight, with no cameras present, signs the bill, which sort of was indicative of, you could see this as a very Clintonian approach. He did a little bit of wringing his hands that he thought that the bill was mean-spirited. He obviously was in the middle of an election year and was counting on support from the gay community, but at the same time, basically from the moment the bill came about in May, signaled that he would likely sign it, but with sort of misgivings. And he ended up doing so, and it ended up being a bill that had no legal impact whatsoever for 8 years. The first gay couple to actually be legally married in the United States was in Massachusetts, and in May of 2004, 6 months after the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled in their case, and obviously we've seen everything that happened since then, and only after couples that got married in Massachusetts realized that actually this piece of paper that may have tremendous symbolic value to them is totally useless outside Massachusetts state borders, did people look back at the Defense of Marriage Act and see it not only as a sort of an election year political issue, but something that needed to be dealt with legally. And the Supreme Court took 2 cases in not this past term, but the term before, dealing with gay marriage, and the one that they had the more expansive ruling on was one that removed or deemed unconstitutional the provision of the bill that dealt with the federal meaning of marriage and spouse and husband and wife, and now in the, I don't know what the count is now, the 20 whatever states that have gay marriage in the United States, federal law treats them as equal. States still have it, within their bounds to set their own laws about what types of other states' contracts they'll recognize. Lawyers talk about challenging that part of the bill as well in courts. We'll see.
Okay. So for a lot of the timeline that you're discussing, it's been post Senator Dole's retirement from the Senate. So he was Republican leader prior to his retirement, and then obviously went into election season. What are you finding, or do you have any understanding based on other research that you've done about his role? Or
yeah, I mean, so it's a really interesting time for Dole. So he is obviously a senator from Kansas. He's majority leader, and he's already by May of '96 the presumptive nominee of his party. Basically, as this issue is gestating in certain corners, at least from his perspective, from on the right, opposition to gay marriage, or concern about the sort of consequences of a Hawaii decision. Throughout '95, he was the front runner and likely nominee of his party and was majority leader. And not sure the last time there's been an active congressional leader who has also been running full bore for the presidency during that time. And it was politically difficult and, by his own effective acknowledgement, unsustainable, which is why he ended up weeks after the bill was introduced in May, announcing that he was going to step down from his post as leader simultaneously and leave the Senate. Basically, those are three hats that are kind of impossible to wear at the same time. And so my curiosities intersect with, he's an interesting figure in that year to me on a number of levels because of that. He ends up co-sponsoring the bill. In the Senate version is written by Don Nichols, who was from Oklahoma, a very conservative Republican senator who ended up becoming whip when Dole moved on and Trent Lott became leader, and Nichols had been head of the Republican Policy Conference. He also considered himself a sort of protege of Dole's. I think they were very personally close, more or less from the moment that Nichols came into the Senate. And Nichols was incredibly ambitious. He had goals to rise into leadership, and he was also interested in being Dole's running mate. And it's become clear to me through things I've seen in Nichols' papers and here that, what some of the reporting was at the time, that he was on some version of a shortlist is true. And so Nichols sought out Dole to co-sponsor this bill with him. And those are the two names that are on it in May of '96 when it comes out. And so my interests are and simultaneously there's a House version of the bill. My interests are generally, and this isn't specific to Senator Dole, but are, how did this bill get drafted? How did these two provisions that don't necessarily have to go with one another come together? What are the outside influences, outside groups, lobbyists, think tanks that are helping to shape legislators' understanding of this issue? What are the negotiations that are working themselves out before this comes, before it becomes public? And then simultaneously, he's a presidential candidate, and he's just gotten through a primary season where his greatest concern was challenges from the right, mostly Graham in the beginning, and then Steve Forbes. But Dole's the sort of consistent knock on Dole during that primary was that he was insufficiently conservative, and that especially on sort of social issues, he never worried about losing to Buchanan, but Pat Buchanan was the person who probably gave the sort of loudest voice to this, was that Dole was sort of insufficiently religious and insufficiently committed to sort of, what at the time were often called family values to be a nominee of his party at that time. And so, and then at the same time, Dole is, by May, is now going to be the nominee of his party and is pivoting to a general election where obviously he doesn't need to run to Clinton's right, but wants a contrast on, he uses the word character a lot, which is both a critique of Clinton's personal character, but also Dole's trying to tell a broader story, I think, of, sort of American decline and a lack of responsibility, and is getting a lot of pressure from conservatives within his party to make part of that story that he tells about moral issues, social issues, which at the time, partial birth abortion, a constitutional amendment ensuring a right to school prayer, and there's a whole sort of litany of concerns, and gay marriage is this kind of new thing that comes out of nowhere and people think is very, very convenient. And so part of what I wanted to understand was that, it's clear to me that part of the strategy that made Republicans, the political strategy behind this bill was, let's force Bill Clinton to have to choose between basically his liberal activist base, his gay, wasn't clear how many gay votes there were, but definitely gay fundraising community was sort of, and remains a big part of the kind of Democratic money infrastructure. Let's make Clinton choose between them and his desire to project a kind of sort of, more socially moderate position, and trying to get that seen through, using archives, simultaneous materials to get a sense of how people who were conceiving this bill saw the sort of political context of it and what it would mean for this to happen in a campaign year is important to me.
So what kind of materials are you looking at here in the Dole archives?
So I should note I'm like halfway through my week here, so very much a work in progress to answer this question. So there are a few different sets of materials. There's stuff from his, so the archives have stuff from his leadership office, from his Senate office and staff, and also from the campaign. And so I've been looking at materials from all of those. He has legislative aides, and part of what I was just talking with Audrey about and need to talk to Sarah about is figuring out actually which particular legislative advisor. They get these portfolios of issues that are not always designed or conceived intuitively based on an individual's interests or expertise, and trying to figure out an issue. It's pretty obvious if you have an agriculture legislative aide, that person's going to negotiate the farm bill every 5 years, and you could, there might be some things that fall in some place between, is this an agriculture issue or an environmental issue? But when an issue comes out of nowhere, it's actually sort of hard for, there wasn't a pre-existing office code for gay marriage before this. And so trying to figure out, hey, where would this physically be in a, office suite of file cabinets, which is, to some degree, you're, as a researcher, trying to imagine, like, okay, whose desk would this have ended up on, and who would have had to respond to this, and a lot of when I first get to an archive is trying to just kind of come up with my own understanding of how did this office work, right? A lot of it is sort of like, it sounds so sad to describe my job this way, but it's like forensic org chart design, right? Like, I'm now going into an office that hasn't existed for 20 years, and there's a whole lot of paper here, and I'm trying to figure out, like, how did decisions get made in this office, and who got copied on everything, and were they making these decisions in memos, or were they having meetings, and if so, or what are the records of the meetings, and did some people make their decisions aloud? And and each of us who's been in any sort of work environment realizes that if you start to think about all of your offices as an archive, you'd realize, yes, there are probably going to be some people in the office who have a very rich paper trail because they write down every last thing in a meeting, and there's some people who do everything off the top of their head, and it probably doesn't get written down, and some people take notes on their phone calls, some people don't, and so a lot of it is actually just sort of figuring out, hey, I'm pretty sure that people had to have been talking about this in this period. Who would they have been, and what would a record of that look like? And so that's the stuff on the sort of office side that I'm trying to figure out, and then the other question is, how high does this go as an issue of interest? I mean, as I said, Bob Dole had a lot going on in his life in early 1996. What I can tell from at least that period I'm looking at is, they would give him these decision memos that were very straightforward, and there'd be a check. It would end with a yes or no or a multiple choice thing, and often it was, from things like so-and-so wants to have their picture taken with you, yes or no. Senator whatever wants you to sign on to this. Do you want to sign on to this? Yes, no. And some of it's a little, there are like more options to sort of weasel out of a yes or a no. Should I tell them yes? Should I tell them no? Should I not say anything? But obviously not every question in the office went up to Senator Dole, and not every question in the office probably went up to his chief of staff. And in these cases, for the historical record, actually, you know, the absences of things are kind of telling in their own way. And so, you know, I was just asked, is it you or is it Sarah who asked, did I find a smoking gun yet today? And it's like, no, there is a smoking gun, but, you know, if there's a corpse and no smoking gun, then that kind of tells you something, right? Not sure what, but that's you know, to mix mystery metaphors, the dog that didn't bark is interesting too. And so the places where, in retrospect, this seems like a major piece of legislation, you know, it's the, as best I can tell, Bill Clinton has apologized basically for two official acts that he engaged in as president. One of them is being slow to deal with the genocide in Rwanda, and the other one is signing the Defense of Marriage Act. These are the two things that he's, you know, sort of, you know, publicly apologized for. So in retrospect, this is, you know, there are a lot of bills that go through the House and Senate every year. This is one that, not just because I'm working on it, but I think has a fair amount of, you know, historical weight in retrospect. But if at the time nobody in the office was taking this seriously, or it either means that they didn't think it was a big deal, or they didn't think it was controversial, or they didn't think that there were any tactical or strategic questions to work out, and that there wasn't any of the sort of deal-making brokering that a majority leader like Dole would be involved in. And that's one area where archives are valuable in a different way to a researcher than interviews, which I do a lot of, are because if I ask somebody to meet me for an interview to talk about the Defense of Marriage Act, they come in to talk about the Defense of Marriage Act, which is good, because that's what I asked them to do. And then I ask them questions about the Defense of Marriage Act. And it's very hard to get a sense of perspective at the time. And people's memories are faulty, but it's a different issue, which is like the Defense of Marriage Act becomes a thing that we're talking about in that period, right? If I spend enough time going through contemporaneous materials of different kinds and realize that the Defense of Marriage Act isn't something that people are talking about at the time, that's something that would be very hard to elicit in an interview in the same way. And so, and it's something that I've been a newspaper reporter and a magazine writer and editor, and you know, something that contemporaneous journalism does very poorly is write about things that aren't happening. That you know, often, mostly because the conventions of writing to get stuff onto the front page, you know, you need action. But often the most interesting things are about the sort of absence of tensions that we would expect. You know, I mean, to take the example of gay marriage, the most interesting thing, I think, just in the politics right now of gay marriage are the number of people who aren't talking about it, right? Like, there's hardly anybody in the Republican Party that wants to talk about gay marriage anymore, which is a shift from a couple of years ago and is a massive shift from a decade ago. It's a very hard story to write well about, but that's where the obvious news is, but it's not capital N news in the way that, you know, and the whole economy of a newspaper is writing stuff that'll get onto page one, and people didn't do something yesterday, but it's interesting for these reasons, very rarely is sort of convincing. And so that is a place where, you know, there are, even where there are good contemporaneous journalistic accounts of things, journalists don't do a good job with. And so archives, if you get the breadth of whether it's a person or an office or a, you know, community or network, and you can sort of see where the the silences are, those become revealing in their own way. And then the challenge to someone like me later is as a writer or historian to make sense of those silences in a way that maybe the journalism of the time couldn't.
As an archivist, you've just articulated a whole picture so beautifully. I'm kind of overcome.
It'll be on the internet forever now. So.
Yeah. I'll give you one more question, and then we'll open it up to other folks. So what other research collections have you visited, or do you plan to visit for this project?
Yeah, so a number of them of different types. There are a few other members of the House and Senate who were involved in this, Senator Nichols, Congressman Barr, whose papers are also at in university or university-attached collections that I've used. There are a number of groups, almost all I think on the left, gay rights groups or their allies like the ACLU that have given their papers at various times to also university archives. Those have been fairly useful. And in a lot of smaller collections, a few places where journalists have given their papers, people who are covering gay politics at some point or another, and you get actually their contemporaneous notes from interviews with sources has been useful. There are not a lot of sort of centralized repositories for the periods I'm looking at, and they sort of go at angles between sort of institutions, organizations, individuals, but I'm spending, in a way that's very different from my previous two books, a lot more of what I'm doing is being driven by archival research that I then am augmenting with interviews, as opposed to in the other cases it was the other way around, where I would go interview people and then think, oh, maybe there's a record of that somewhere that I can track down, and the useful thing in this case is building the spine of my narrative through documents, is not just the sort of, and the reason I was giving before, but people's memories are, and so as a journalist, the gold standard is always thought to be like an on-the-record interview with a source or subject, and that's always sort of seen as the test of like, were you lazy or not, right? Like, did you talk to the senator about that? Well, turns out a lot of time talking to senators is not that interesting. But there's some idea that if you don't, like that's what you want. You got fresh quotes from people in your piece that are attributable. And it's obviously incredibly valuable for certain types of reporting to be able to interrogate folks. But you also recognize doing this, and this is we're joking about the 90s being history, but this is a really sweet spot for somebody doing my work where you have a paper trail that is starting to open up, and obviously your collection has been open a few years, but there are other, so Senator Kennedy, who was basically the leading champion of gay rights in the Senate. His papers are just being processed now, and he's given them to the Kennedy Library, and so I've been corresponding with an archivist there, and they have every desire to be helpful to me, but it's like literally they have boxes and people have not gone through them to make them usable. And so, we're at this, and then there are other members of Congress who are involved in this stuff whose papers are still under some version of seal or deed or restricted for a period of time, and in some cases I've worked to get approval to get access to them, for them to be open just for me, but in some cases they're unavailable. But by and large, it's a period where you can start to get at stuff, contemporaneous materials and archive, but also a lot of my subjects are still alive and available and reachable, which if you go back any farther into the past, that part stops being true. If you get any closer into the present, there's no paper available. But the thing you recognize is just how bad people's memories are. In this case, there's a because people's opinions on the issue have changed, I think there is some self-serving or selective memory about often it's folks on the left who want to remember, left defined very broadly in this case, who want to remember themselves being more progressive on the issue than they probably were at the time. But a lot of times just people, it's 20 years ago. And people have a very poor memory for details or chronology. And I sit down with folks who are incredibly smart and sharp and are in lines of work, they're lawyers or politicians, where they're supposed to be fact-oriented, and they are telling me something, and I know that's just not the way it happened because, and they're telling me, oh, that happened in 1994, and I'm like, no, that happened in 1997 because it was in the newspaper, and you realize that as a journalist, if you just rely on live sources, you may have access, but you often just, I think, probably are getting things that are fairly inaccurate, and at the same time are certainly warped by just the sort of natural biases of memory. And so being in a position where I feel a little bit more like a lawyer in a deposition where now everything is on my iPad instead of a stack of papers, but I can go sit down in an interview, and instead of just saying, so tell me what you were thinking in 1994, I can say, oh, I found this memo that you wrote in 1994. Would you mind taking a look at it? And and I sit there for 90 seconds while they reread this. I say, so what do you think was going on there? It's like, maybe they remember actually having written it, maybe they don't, but they say, oh yeah, the guy I sent it to, he was the one who was doing this, and she was the one who was responsible for that, and I was probably telling them, see, I mentioned this here, and it's like, oh, okay, well that's something that I would never have known to ask, and they would have never been triggered to tell me, and then I often can develop a relationship with a source after I've met them where I guarantee something I find now, I'll go back in the next couple of weeks and sort of work through what I find here, and I'll send an image of something in an email to a source I already have a rapport with, and I'll say, hey, I found this in the Dole archives. Do you have any idea, or what you meant by X or Y? And that allows me to get a certain type of context, and it often leads people to remember other things that I would not have ever been prompted to bring up, and they wouldn't have either.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, Sasha. Why don't we go ahead and open it up for questions? Anybody out there?
My question is, other than Bill Clinton, have you had anyone else who has had profound misgivings for voting for the Defense of Marriage Act, and who might they be?
Yeah, so it passed with 85 votes. I mean, there was a tiny number of senators who voted for it, and it was 60-something in the House. And just to put this in context, I can only find one senator, and I'm sure the number is higher than this, one senator who was clearly on the record as supporting gay marriage, full stop, before the Defense of Marriage Act came out. A lot of the Democrats who voted against it, someone like John Kerry, for example, said he didn't support gay marriage, but he did not think it was the role of Congress to intercede preemptively in it. And John Kerry didn't come out in favor of gay marriage until I think after 2008. So I think there are a lot of folks who have, Democrats who, so I think there's sort of two separate things. One, people who just said they were sort of wrong and changed their opinion on gay marriage, and then people who felt, I mean, there were a lot of Democrats, and I think Clinton gave voices, he just ended up signing it, right, they felt like they were trapped by opponents who were using this issue out of opportunism or convenience. And I sort of skated over this, but there was another piece of legislation that was moving through the Senate at the same time, which was the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which was a bill that would have made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation in hiring and firing and promotion, which basically would have treated sexual orientation the same way that the Civil Rights Act treats race and gender and age. And a version of that had been basically the holy grail of the gay rights movement in Washington for 20 years. And gay rights groups and their allies in Congress thought that they were finally getting, Clinton supported it, Clinton said he would sign it. And basically, a deal was cut so that they would get a vote simultaneously on DOMA and ENDA, and nobody ever thought that they would win on the Defense of Marriage Act. They thought that they could win on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and that ended up failing by a single vote. And so there was a conclusion, which is, I think, very reasonable, just as a matter of sort of tactics at the time, which was, fine, we'll give our opponents a symbolic victory on the Defense of Marriage Act. It does not take away any rights that anybody in the United States has right now. Nobody's actually hurt by it now, and nobody would see any effect of the law for 8 years. And if we can trade that for something that will actually have immediate legal impact, then that's a good day at the office. And they ended up losing the ENDA vote by one vote. And then the great irony of American political history in the last 20 years is we have seen a obviously dramatic shift in opinion on gay marriage. We now have gone from no states to 20-something states. It looks like it's only going to move in one direction. People think it's quite likely the Supreme Court will impose basically a one-size-fits-all federal standard on this question, possibly within the next 12 months. And still, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act has been introduced in every Congress for the last 20 years and has yet to be passed. And there are now states in this country where gay people can get married and are recognized by the federal government as married and can still be fired from their jobs or denied housing legally by somebody who states that as the reason for it. And if you'd gone to anybody in the gay rights movement in 1996, let alone 94, any time before then, said, which do you think will happen first? That it becomes that gay people can get married, or that there are things that stop people from getting fired for being gay, you would have had total unanimity about what they assumed the sequence of events was. And so I think that when people who took votes in the Senate, they're often thinking about it in the context of that it's not just a sort of universal. I think a lot of people had sort of rationales at the time that allowed them to justify that vote in retrospect.
Yes, I think I heard you say there's approximately 26 states that allow gay marriage. Do each of those 6 states or 20-some states recognize other states in their marriages?
Yes. So, so the Supreme Court just like an hour ago accepted a stay in Virginia. I mean, literally it's changing week by week. But every state that recognizes gay marriage, which means, and that came about either in some cases because of a state court, right, as was the case in Massachusetts, in some cases because of a ballot initiative, as was the case in Washington and Maine 2 years ago. In some states, legislation, as in New York, and in some states now, federal courts in their circuits. Each of those states both issues licenses, regardless of gender, and accepts other states. There was a period where New York, where Eliot Spitzer, after, there are like no governors whose names I can say anymore without people laughing. So, There's a period after Massachusetts legalized marriage in 2004, where once Spitzer had come into office, he, I think as a matter of executive privilege or whatever it's called in New York, said we will recognize Massachusetts' gay marriage licenses in New York. And that was 4 years before New York legalized marriage, but otherwise it's tended to move in lockstep, where a state decides sort of fully as a matter of their law that they will both offer them and recognize them.
I was wondering, when you look at the history of the progress in the gay rights movement, it seems like most of the advances have been made in the judicial system and not in the legislative system. I get there are some states like New York, like you said, that weren't. Has your research elucidated anything as to why that split has existed?
I mean, I think, and I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an expert on civil rights history, but I mean, certainly there's been an idea that civil rights movements, the black civil rights movement, the women's movements have found their first victories through courts, and that it's often the political process that lags, and which is why one of the debates that is thought to be taking place sort of in the minds of Supreme Court justices when they decide whether they want to take a case is, will they be getting out in front of the political process in a way that's counterproductive? This is a debate that historians have about Brown v. Board and about Roe v. Wade. In the case of Brown, that no Jim Crow state was going to, through its legislature or political process in 1954, desegregated schools. And so, and state courts in certainly the states of the old Confederacy were very unlikely to do that. And so, so civil rights attorneys in this case, mostly NAACP, thought that federal courts were going to be their only path to it. It came with a huge cost, which was, decades of resistance to states that felt, frankly, not unreasonably, so the federal government was imposing its interpretation of the Constitution on them. And there are a lot of people who look at that and they don't argue that Brown v. Board shouldn't have been decided the way it was, but see that the cost of the backlash was significant. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who at the time that Roe was decided was the basically premier women's rights litigator in the United States, has said in retrospect that she thinks that was decided too soon because there wasn't enough political will that had been built up. The debate over abortion was fairly new at that point, and that the backlash, I mean, she basically says that Roe v. Wade created the pro-life movement because the federal government interceded on this issue while public opinion was still sort of working itself out and the political process should be sort of allowed to run. And so I think this is a constant tension, and I could Ginsburg also said something recently that seemed more sympathetic to the idea that she'd be ready to see the court move on gay marriage, but one could easily imagine that the court decides not to take a case on marriage in the next couple of years, and that it is the 5 more liberal justices, the 4 and then Kennedy, 3 women, Breyer and Kennedy, because they, it's not unreasonable to look at this and say, like, the only thing that could stop gay marriage from being legal in 40 states within 3 or 4 years in the United States is something that triggers a massive backlash. And the only thing right now that could trigger we had a president come out in an election year in favor of gay marriage, and like people yawned. You have Republican politicians doing it, nobody seems to care. could you imagine that a Supreme Court decision that tells Mississippi that they have to give out gay marriage licenses could provoke some sort of backlash comparable to what you saw with school desegregation or abortion? Yeah, I mean, it's not unimaginable. And so I think this is always the tension between the two. I think it's less likely in this case, but there's been an idea that and one big shift, though, I should say, is like during the period of the Warren Court, there was unquestionably an idea among sort of civil rights groups that the federal judiciary was their friend. From 1980 to 92, where you had 3 Republican administrations, you had turnover in the Supreme Court and in a lot of lower federal benches. And so it was not until very recently that gay rights litigators thought that they had they thought that once you start going into federal courts that it's a problem. They were discouraging it. I mean, in 1986, the Supreme Court ruled in Bowers v. Hardwick, they upheld state sodomy bans. And so it hasn't always been that. And in the years after that, some very conservative state courts ended up, Kentucky, Tennessee in the late 80s, early 90s, struck down their sodomy bans. And so what you would think of is that the state courts in conservative states are actually more friendly than the federal judiciary was.
I'd like to ask a question about, first of all, the assignment of the Senate bill. Was Dole involved in that?
Sorry,
The assignment of the Senate bill for defense of marriage. And 2, what were the hearings like?
Yeah, so
who showed up, who didn't, how they
great
played?
question. So Dole had moved on from the Senate by the time, so the House went first, and they moved very quickly. There was a subcommittee hearing a week after the bill was introduced that was some law professor, legal academic types on each side, a couple of religious leaders on each side, and somebody from the Family Research Council and somebody from one of the gay group from the Human Rights Campaign on the other side. That wasn't particularly contentious, but then there was a full Judiciary Committee hearing a few weeks later, and that was incredibly contentious. And the Judiciary Committee is sort of famous for drawing some of the most ideological members of both parties. The political scientist Richard Fenno has done a sort of typology of congressional committees about the types of members that they draw. And if you're going to the Judiciary Committee, it tends to mean that, at least in the old model, you don't care about getting pork to bring back to your district, which probably means you're from a pretty safe district. And you and or your party leaders are ready for you, especially this is true in the 90s, to take votes on school prayer and abortion. And it's a place where basically both parties think that the other side is going to hatch sort of their most devious plans to change America. And so you put people there that either want the fight or can afford to take tough votes to stop things. And so, and often they tend to be people with law degrees who like arguing. So, so the Democrats on that committee at the time were Barney Frank, Pat Schroeder, John Conyers, some of their most liberal members, but also, some of their most combative members. And at least in the case of Frank and Pat Schroeder, very media savvy and very well connected with sort of outside liberal interest groups. And so both that and the floor debate, where Barney Frank was managing the floor debate for the Democrats against Stone, the leadership basically had given up on it, is lost. And so those were incredibly contentious and incredibly personal. And Frank at some point called out a Republican who had said something along the lines of, gay marriages would threaten the institution of marriage, and you know, and really personalize it and says, like, how does my relationship ruin your marriage? Tell me one heterosexual marriage that's been ruined by whatever. And so in part because of just his skills as a debater, in part because he'd been an object of sort of derision and ridicule from Republicans personally about his sexuality. I mean, there had been that incident where Dick Armey had called him Barney Fag in an interview. It was within a year before that. That you know, he became sort of lightning rod for an intensity of debate. In the Senate, there were hearings, but at that point, the real energy was trying to figure out a deal that would bring the non-discrimination bill to a vote, and a lot of the gay groups were lobbying far more aggressively to see that happen than they were on marriage.
We've got time for, we'll take one more.
All of our questions have been philosophical and deeper in nature, and this is more mechanical.
Okay.
I'm interested, you did touch upon how you used the archives, but I'd like to know, when you came in, did you know pretty much exactly what you wanted to look for and have a list of things, presented them to our staff, or did you develop your list as you researched?
Yeah, great questions. And so I'll explain it, but the answer is both. You know, so archives now, thankfully on the internet, almost always have what they call a finding aid or an inventory, which is a list of what they have. Some places have it at a box level or a carton level, and some have it at a folder level, and they are varying degrees of descriptive and varying degrees of useful in their description or interpretable in their description to an outsider who doesn't know the collection. So when, and Audrey can talk about this better than I can, but you know, when people are processing a collection, it means taking this raw stack of stuff and putting it in some sort of, you know, organized system that then allows somebody like me to go through an inventory and request particular boxes or folders depending on how the place works. So I, through emails with the two archivists here, put together, you know, I spent, I don't know, a couple of days probably total. This is a very large collection. And part of it was my, as I was talking about before, trying to get an understanding of not knowing a whole lot about how Dole managed his office, and I've covered Congress a little bit, but not knowing a whole lot about how a leadership office is organized to begin with. It was a really weird period where they had people who were part-time, half on the staff of the campaign and half on the staff of the leader's office, and so he leaves in the middle of this period that I'm looking at. So part of it is, you know, going through and trying to figure out where there'll be stuff, and I sent a list of, how many boxes did I? A lot. 50, 90, I don't know. They've been wheeling them in for me all week. So, and in some cases, I'm very sure, or fairly certain, that there will be stuff in that box that will be really useful to me. In a lot of cases, I think there might be, and in some cases, it's a total fishing expedition, and in some cases, I have to go through a lot of stuff. I mean, some of those, like, you know, you saw me, like in some cases, like those boxes, I take one out, I look at the one folder, there's like 2 pieces of paper in there, and none of them have anything to do with what I care about. I put it back and I'm done with it in 30 seconds. In other cases, I'm going through a box for 3 hours because there's a lot of stuff that I just need to get through. A lot of it might not have anything to, I mean, it's very needle haystacky, you know, and so I request stuff, and that's what I've been doing for the last 2 days. I think I got through everything I requested, and now I need to have a talk with Sarah about other places that there might be things I want to look at tomorrow, and those will be informed by some of my understanding of what I now have some idea of where things might be that are interesting to me. And and each archive is very different. And some places have their stuff on site, which means that you can ask for a box and it's in your hands 5 minutes later. Some places I have to request in advance because they have to truck it in from some other warehouse. And at that point, if you're somebody like me who's in from out of town for 4 days or whatever, I need to request everything but before I get there, because there's not enough time to sort of be responsive, and that there's a lot more pressure on me in that case to order wisely. Can't send stuff back to the kitchen. Yeah.
That's a wonderful way to wrap up the session. Thanks so much for
Thank
your
you.
time.
Thank
you
you all
for being here, and thank you for your support of the archive. We look forward to seeing you soon.